Right, first up, let me start by saying there is no such thing as a perfect weld in sheet metal. The best weld in sheet metal is no weld at all. It's a replacement panel. But invariably, when you're restoring a car, you will end up having to do extensions to panels, repairs to panels. Some panels just can't be removed without major work. So in those circumstances, this is the best technique. Second thing I'm going to mention is ditch the Mig Welder. You might not want to hear that because you might have just bought a Mig Welder, but TIG welding is the way to go if you want to get a perfect weld. And you didn't come here for average welds, you came here for perfect welds. So that's what I'm going to show you, or at least as best I know how. I'm cheating a little bit here by using the guillotine to prepare the pieces for welding. When you're making panels for a car, you won't be able to do that. You'll have to make them fit. And the more time you spend fitting them up, the better the result is going to be, and the less time you'll have cleaning up and dealing with any nasty consequences from warping and such. The trick is to minimize heat input, but also manage that heat input. The third thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need access to both sides of the panel. That's not always possible, and in those situations you might just have to MIG weld it, but wherever it's possible it should be done. And it's possible on things like rear quarters, rear arches, where invariably if the outside is rusted, the inner arch is also gone as well. So you can remove what needs to come out of the inner arch, usually to the halfway point or wherever the seam is, and then you've got access to all of the quarter that you need to work on. You need access for hammer and dolly and some form of grinding the weld off, ideally, as well. Now there's lots of videos out there telling you to leave such and such gap or whatever, enough to get a panel tool in or something to hold the panels together. That's not going to work for this technique, and this is the best technique. What you want is ideally basically no gap at all. If you can see a good bit of light through it, it's too much. Now you can adjust the gap as you go. I'll go through that in a bit, but when you're making the panel, you want to aim for perfect fit up. Get it as close as possible, and that will give you the easiest time welding it and the least warping in the final result. You want to make sure the metal is clean, free from any oxidation or corrosion or any contaminants that might make the weld bubble up as you go, because that's just going to make a lot more work and a lot more warping. You want to do a series of tacks, ideally about year far apart, 2 to 3 inches, 50 to 75 mil, something like that. If you can't get at the back with a grinder or anything, you want to leave enough room between the tacks to get hammer and dolly in so that you can avoid the tacks. You may not need to tack the metal with any filler, in which case you don't need to worry about grinding off the back. But something this thin, and this is 22 gauge, about 0.76 mil supposedly, so 7.5 there, 7.2 even, 7.7, yeah. Something this thin, you're going to need to add filler for the tacks, otherwise it'll just blow through. And this is typical on Japanese cars for some of the lighter duty panels, which is the sort of thing I work on. Anything bigger than this, about 1 mil and up, you can just tack without any rod wherever the panels are touching and then adjust the gap as you go. But something this thin, you're going to need to add filler, otherwise it's just going to blast through and make more work for you. So you need access to the back, and you need to add filler for the tacks on the thin stuff. I've picked 22 gauge because this is about the thinnest you'll ever use, and this is the hardest to work with. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. You want to get the panels level, so you can use panel clamps or magnets or whatever you've got, but they need to be level, certainly where you do the tacks. When doing the tacks, make sure the end of the rod's clean and it hasn't picked up any dirt from the floor or anything, and tack on the rod so that the arc goes through the rod into the metal. pull up a little ball of rod and then let it sink into the metal, and then just as it's flowing, stop. I've got my amps set to 29 and I've got my welding shade on 8 so that I can see what I'm doing. Technically that's not a welding shade, that's a plasma cutting shade, but my mask can do that, so for this low current you need that. That's all it takes. That's your tack. So now I'll do the rest, clamping as I go. Right, that's the tack's done, and at this stage you check for any warping after it's cooled down. If the tacks shrink too much, the panels can end up doing this, or trying to, and you can feel that in the gap. There's a little bit there, so I'm going to open that up slightly just by tapping the tack weld. It doesn't take much, don't go nuts. And that one a bit. Yeah, that's pretty much got it. I've got that panel level again. That'll help. There. And the rest are pretty good. So now I can do the weld. When it comes to the ends, you want to do the same again. You want to add a tack on the end. Ideally, you want to make the panel larger than it needs to be, so that you can trim it down to suit, because you're always going to lose a little bit at the end. But if you're making one panel meet the other, it'd be better to make it a bit longer so that you can weld there and then you lose less, and then trim it off to suit. So for the welding, I start on a tack, build a weld pool, and then travel up slight little zigzags until I get to another weld, another tack, get that flowing, and then come back over to pull a little bit of mass and volume out of the tack back into the weld, and then carry on along the whole piece. As you can see, the welding process is very fast, faster than Mig for sure. Blown through. What was the danger? I lost a little bit of footage here, just explaining how if you do get a blow through, you build it up the same way as doing the tacks, just one small little bit at a time, and let it cool in between so you don't get too much heat input. That one went better. Right, as you can see, it has warped, but that's okay. I'm going to sort that out. The next step is to remove any mass or extra bulk from the tacks, and you'll find a lot of it's on the back, which is why you need access to the back. You don't want it flush, you're just taking the bulk out. Right, now we've got a fairly uniform thickness weld across the length, but as you can see it's warped, and if this was a big panel there'd be buckles and all sorts in it. But watch this. Now I'm using the anvil on my vise. On the car you'd be using a dolly. I could use a dolly, but the panel's got no weight to it, so it just flap about and bend itself as I do. So hammer from the front on the weld seam. And again, it doesn't take much. Right, now we've got a basically flat panel. Took all the shrinking out by stretching it with the hammer, and it also has the added benefit of smoothing the weld out a great degree. And now, and not before now, I can sand the rest of the weld. Now if you like, at this stage you can give it another hammer in, now that the weld is nice and smooth. But if you hammer it before you've got the lumps of the tack welds out or any irregularities, it'll stretch more where the lumps are and you won't get a nice even panel. You can shrink it back down if you just run the weld torch over it again and re-liquify it. That'll pull it back together, but it's best to just avoid it if you can. You don't want to try and sand out every trace of the weld, especially on something this thin, because it'll thin the metal far too much. You always get a little edge at the end of a weld, so if you remove any trace of the weld, the panel will always end up thinner than when you started. It's best to just leave a little edge if there is one, as long as you've got a uniform thickness. So why do you want to do it this way instead of just running a MIG bead over it? Well, two reasons. One, the warping, that's the main reason. But secondly, and arguably more important, is the strength. Now a great big MIG weld down the middle is going to be strong, but it's going to create a stress razor in the panel. And it's going to create stress where stress wasn't intended to be when the car was originally designed. Everything's a spring, especially on cars. Everything moves, everything flexes, and if you remove that movement from a certain part of a panel in a certain direction, then it's going to cause more movement in other places, and it will lead to cracks forming and possibly catastrophic failure. Chassis legs falling off and stuff. It doesn't happen, but it's better to design against it. Now a MIG weld is never going to give that sort of profile, and if you do grind it off to that sort of level, it's going to have no strength in it. There's going to be gaps, there's going to be voids. It's just invariable. It always happens on something this thin. And there's a lot more cleanup with a MIG weld than there is with TIG. You saw how quick that was to sand off. It took nothing, and the two panels are fused. The trick is to minimize the heat input, and with such low current traveling so fast, there's hardly any heat input going into the panel, so it reduces the chance of warping and shrinking. Now I'm going to put this through its paces here. I'm expecting some cracks to appear. I'm going to run it through the bead roller twice, straight down the weld, trying to stretch it out. And this is why there's no such thing as a perfect weld. up to the light. So far so good. Flatten that back out. And hold it up to the light again. And just some tiny bits at the end where I would have cut it off anyway. So not too bad really. And again, you can't do that with a MIG weld. You just can't. It survived pretty well, that. Flatten out a bit. And it behaves like a single piece of metal. That's what you want to aim for, really, because that's what's going to perform the best when it's on the car. Now, I did mention I'd tell you what to do if the gap isn't quite right, so I'll show you that now. Right, like I said earlier, you can open the gap up if the panels are too close together and they've pulled together and warped by just hitting on there, and hopefully you can see the gap has now increased quite a lot at that end just from that little hammering. Now if you want to close the gap up but the panels aren't warped, so the panels are in the right place but the gap's too big, you can hammer the gap to shrink the metal together. I've gone a bit too far there actually. That spreads the metal out and closes the gap up, and it's still showing quite a big gap, but it is much tighter, trust me on that one. There you go. You can see it's touching in a few places there, up to about there now. Now I'll open this one up again. See, now we've got a big gap that side. Now let's say the gap's too big but the panels are warped somehow, say there was a bit of pressure on it as you welded it or something. Unlikely, but you might need to do this. You can then re-liquify the weld and it'll shrink back down when it cools. So I'll show you that. As you can see, you can go over it multiple times if the first go doesn't shrink it enough, and as you can see it's coming right back together again, the ends are touching pretty much. You could then just smush them a bit to make the gap even better if you wanted, but that would probably weld fine. Certainly in anything thicker than this, that'd be fine. If the panels are too close together but they're in the right place, then you're just going to have to remove material from the edges. You could try shrinking the panel, but it's going to be a nightmare. You're just going to have to try and cut or sand a bit off the edge, maybe break the tacks and redo them later. So I hope that helps some of you out. It's a technique I'd seen talked about but never actually seen demonstrated. All the best metal workers use this method that I've seen anyway, and they all talked about it, but I'd never actually seen a demo of it. So I thought I'd show you how I figured out how to do it, because I pretty much learned on the fly. So hopefully that saves you a bit of time learning. So I guess that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to see more. See ya.